A lot of people think Steve Jobs would hate the Apple Pencil.
Who wants a stylus? You have to get them and put them away and you lose them. Yuck. Nobody wants a stylus.
Granted, that was pretty convincing, but I don't think that would be true today, and I'm going to tell you why. According to the internet, Steve Jobs, he hated styluses. So here's a little equation. The Apple Pencil is a stylus, and so therefore Steve Jobs would have hated the Apple Pencil had he lived long enough to yell at the engineer who proposed it in a meeting. But hold up one second. I'm not so sure that Steve Jobs would hate the Apple Pencil. And besides, where did the internet even get this idea that Steve Jobs was this stylus-hating, rampaging rage monster in the first place?
We're going to use a stylus. No. Who wants a stylus? You have to get them and put them away and you lose them. Yuck. Nobody wants a stylus.
Case closed. Brad's an idiot. End of video. Throw this dude out the window. Wait. Okay, I know this looks bad, and clearly this is not the face of a man who likes styluses, but I got this. I mean, yeah, he's making fun of styluses on stage in front of a huge audience in what happens to be the most famous product revealing of all time. Oh gosh, I do not got that. Oh. Well, while I recover, let's roll our Steve Stylus story. The iPhone and iOS in general began as a tablet project, not a phone. And it has a pretty funny beginning. Here's Scott Forstall, who used to be Apple's senior VP of iOS, telling it.
It began because Steve hated this guy at Microsoft. That is the actual origin of it. And it wasn't Bill, because he was starting to like Bill by this point. So Steve's wife had a friend who was married to a guy who worked at Microsoft. Every time Steve had any social interaction with that guy, he'd come back just pissed off. And he came back one time after seeing this guy, and that guy was talking about how Microsoft had solved computing. They solved like tablet computing, and they're going to do it with pens. And he just like shoved it in Steve's face the way they were going to like rule the world with their new tablets with their pens. Steve came in on Monday, and there was a set of expletives, and then it was like, let's show them how it's really done. It's like, the first thing is, they're idiots. You don't use a stylus. You know, it's cumbersome. You lose it. You're always like picking it up and putting it down. We're born with 10 styluses. And said, we need to do capacitive touch and it has to be multi-touch. So we went to the hardware team and basically said, like, go do this.
And that was the origin of iOS, an operating system specifically built for touch on tablets. And here's Scott again talking about how it came to be on the iPhone.
Now, how did we get to the iPhone? A few things happened at the same time. I think half of our sales at the time were iPods. We were always looking at what was going to take over the iPod space. And the one thing that seemed like it might do it would be phones. Everyone was starting to carry phones. I was sitting with Steve at lunch one time, and we were both using our phones, and we both had these phones, and we hated them. We started talking, and we looked around, like, everyone around us has a phone, and everyone looks very angsty as they're using them. Like, no one, it seems like it's a pleasurable thing to use the phone, but it's a nice thing for communication. Steve said, do you think we could take that demo and shrink it down small enough to fit in your pocket? It'd be a phone size with that same touch technology.
As a connoisseur of Steve Jobs stories, this sounds a lot like him. I get the impression that Steve either loved something or thought it sucked, and there was absolutely nothing in between. And it appears that styluses fell into the hate category. But here's my counter to Steve's anti-stylus face. What Steve hated about styluses was how they were being used at the time to replace mice as a way of navigating a small interface. In the early 2000s, Microsoft was taking Windows XP, their operating system at the time, and jamming it onto a tablet, and then asking the question, well, if we don't have a mouse, how are our users going to make this work? And the answer they came up with was a stylus. That's what would replace the mouse. Now, in terms of touch capabilities, Windows has come a long, long way, and has been redesigned almost completely since then. But still, if you try to navigate Windows with just your finger, sometimes it gets clunky. Fingers just aren't as accurate as a mouse or a stylus. So if you're going to make touch work, every interaction a user has with the system has to be rethought. Your buttons have to be bigger. Your interface elements have to be larger. And when you break it down, there are a lot of interface interactions in Windows. Steve hated the idea that people were taking technology that they knew, software they already had, and shoving it onto a new tablet or phone form factor. And the reason that it was done this way is because that was the easiest route. Steve Jobs was not known for taking the easiest route. He was known for taking the route that would lead to the best product, the best usable experience. And he felt that you needed to rethink the entire interface around the medium, which is touch, instead of how to force touch into your old medium, which at the time was Windows XP. And his hate wasn't for the stylus itself, it was for what the stylus represented. Bad user experience design. Like the early Windows tablets, smartphones before the iPhone were trying to fit computers into your palm. Smartphones were like mini little laptops with mini little keyboards. Phones used styluses because fingers were just too big and tapped on the wrong links or buttons too often. It was easier to duct tape on a chunk of hardware than it was to rethink all of your software. Okay, man covered in trash. What makes you think Steve Jobs was actually thinking that way? Easy, because he did it before. Oh geez, I feel another flashback coming on. In 1984, Apple released the original Macintosh. To people who are used to using an Apple II or IBM computer, this was unlike anything they had ever seen before. It had a graphical user interface, not green text on a black screen like most computers of the day. You moved around the interface using a cursor that was guided by a mouse. Some engineers at Xerox PARC had thought up the idea, and when Steve saw the demo of their graphical user interface, he knew that this was the future of personal computing. It was that mouse and graphical user interface that would go on to become the stars of the first Macintosh computer. Steve did have one big concern, that software makers would lazily port their crappy DOS or Apple II apps onto the Mac and call it a day. And what he wanted them to do was to rethink their software from the ground up to take advantage of the mouse and their new interface. Of course, once the Macintosh was out in the world, he had no control over the software that was created for it. If nobody took advantage of what made the Macintosh special, then why did consumers have a reason to buy a Macintosh? So the team hatched a plan to take the arrow keys off the keyboard. What? How is that a plan? Stay with me. Computer interfaces at the time were text-based. The only way to move around was to use arrow keys. Using a spreadsheet? Use the arrow keys. Selecting an option? Use the arrow keys. Trying to tell the difference between a water buffalo and a land buffalo? Use the arrow keys. This one is the water buffalo. With no arrow keys, there's no way to navigate those old apps, forcing software makers to rethink the way their software is made and used. Of course, there was a downside, a rather large downside to making it harder for people to make software for your new platform, and that is they don't bother to make software for your new platform. In the Macintosh's case, the sales were horrible, and those terrible sales were one of maybe about a few dozen reasons Steve was flung off the highest balcony of Marini 1 back in 1985.
You haven't seen the last of me.
Yeah, right. Hey, you guys want to grab a Pepsi? The arrow keys were eventually added back to the Apple keyboard, just like a stylus was eventually added to the iPad in the form of the Apple Pencil. And as anyone who uses an iPad with the Apple Pencil will tell you, they use the pencil for drawing or taking notes, but for most interactions, it's way easier just to use your finger to navigate around iOS. Touch is still the primary controller on these devices. The Apple Pencil is not required in any way, shape, or form to use it. There's a keyboard for the iPad now, but it is not required to use it. But what these two things do is they make some tasks far, far easier, but these things aren't core to the experience. They're just accessories to the experience, enhancements to how the operating system already works. Whenever a new product is released that doesn't look like the products that it is replacing, a lot of people won't get it. I mean, heck, sometimes I'm one of those people. And any new product is inevitably going to be compared to what else is out there. I mean, heck, go back and read all the iPhone stories from 2007. iPhone could never run Flash. The sales are hurt by the lack of a keyboard. iPhone will never pass BlackBerry. Reading these old reviews, it's surprising how few people could actually see the future when it was sitting right in front of them. But Steve said it. Styluses equal black. Why can you not accept this, Brad? It does not get any clearer than that. Yeah. Maybe you're right. Maybe he would have been staunchly anti-stylus forever. Steve said a lot of things that he would later change his mind on. He said nobody wanted apps on the iPhone. Early on, he was dead set against them, believing developers should make web apps that worked on Safari, saying the full Safari engine is inside of the iPhone, and so you can write amazing Web 2.0 and Ajax apps that look exactly and behave exactly like the apps on the iPhone. And these apps can integrate perfectly with iPhone services. They can make a call, they can send an email, they can look up a location on Google Maps. As we all know now, it didn't take long for Steve to reverse course on this. By the end of 2007, Apple said that they would be opening up the iPhone to third-party apps the following year. It's hard to believe now. A phone without apps would be like a YouTube video that doesn't beg you to subscribe and ring the bell and leave that comment and share that post and buy that merch and chase that dog and eat that Tide Pod and kick that ball and lick that worm and poke that zombie and feed that goat. I'm sorry, I'm bad at YouTube. Just like that smash button. Steve also said nobody would watch video on an iPod. I'm not convinced people would watch movies on a tiny little screen. To paraphrase Bill Clinton, it's the music, stupid, it's the music. 2 years later, we got video iPods. After the introduction of the iPad, he said he would never make a smaller tablet. Although technically the iPad mini came out shortly after Steve passed away, I'm still counting this because products don't come out of thin air. It takes a lot longer than you think to develop something like a new form factor for the iPad. Steve surely knew and probably signed off on the development of the iPad mini. Heck, he even once said Apple wouldn't make a tablet at all. There are no plans to make a tablet. It turns out people want keyboards. He said this before the iPhone, probably around the same time he was getting mad at Microsoft executives. The sign of an intelligent person is the ability to change one's mind as the situation changes around you. And yeah, Steve Jobs changed his mind a lot. There is one thing that he was consistent about throughout his entire career, and that is in every interview he would say it over and over. He was trying to make the best products possible. Seriously, it is hard to find an interview where he didn't hammer that over and over again. Apple is dedicated to making the best products in the world, and he wasn't afraid to go that extra mile to make an experience great, or at least better. And this is something that's hurt Apple and sometimes helped Apple. In the early days, it hurt Apple. That Mac example I mentioned earlier, he was willing to risk having less software on the original Macintosh to prevent developers from just porting over what already existed. In the short term, that hurt the Mac. And it's hard to see it now, but creating an entirely new operating system for phones and tablets was a risk in 2007. But it was a risk that Jobs saw as necessary in order to make a decent mobile experience. Because to him, the alternative was making a phone that wasn't any better than the phones that already existed at the time. The genius of the iPhone, and many of Apple's products from that era, was taking something that people didn't necessarily like to use and making it infinitely more user-friendly. If Apple was to enter a new market known for bad customer service, like say banking, they wouldn't just release a cool-looking branded credit card like every other company in the world. No, they would do it the hard way. They'd start their own bank and really do something that would disrupt the entire industry. Take advantage of their cuts. Oh, hold up. This is I guess this is a bad example. I could think of a better one. Give me a second. Got it. Okay. If Apple was going to take on video, they wouldn't just make another video service like Hulu or Netflix and then pump a bunch of original content into it like every other media company out there. No, that would be horrible. Crap, another bad example. Look, we will never know what Steve would have thought about the Apple Pencil, but there is one thing that we all know and that we can all agree on, and that is Steve hated bad experiences. And if a stylus was the primary navigation tool for an iOS device, if it was crucial to using an iPad, that it would have been a far worse user experience. I don't think that's what the Apple Pencil is. I don't think the Apple Pencil is a primary interface controller for the iPad. That's still your finger. The Pencil is an accessory to that experience, and that changes everything. Thank you guys for watching. If you like this video, check out some of my other animations I've done. And of course, you can always like and subscribe if you want to see more videos in the future. Thank you for watching, and I'll talk to you in a couple of days.